NATO and the transatlantic relationship. My name is Pasi Hukri, and I'm the Program Manager for Security Policy here at Society and Defense, and I will be moderating today's seminar. I also like to welcome the people following online, as well as you in the venue. Today's seminar is hosted together with the RAND Corporation and the Swedish Defence Research Agency. In this seminar, we will listen to insights regarding the Swedish-US relationship, the current state of NATO, and the foreign policy of the United States going forward. At first, we will listen to Ann Linde, who served as the Minister for Foreign Affairs between 2019 and 2022, and before that as the Minister for European Affairs and Trade between 2016 and 2019. Ann Linde is also the Foreign Minister who handed in Sweden's official NATO application. After Ann Linde, we will listen to Barry Pavel, who's the Vice President of RAND's National Security Research Division and the Director for the National Defence Research Institute. Following their speeches, we will listen to a panel to give their reflections and to discuss. In the panel, we have Colin Smith, who's the Senior International Defence Researcher at RAND, Mike Winnerstig, who's the Department Head of Security Policy at the Swedish Defence Research Agency, and Magnus Christiansson, who's an Associate Professor of War Studies at the Swedish Defence University. We will begin with listening to Ann Linde, the former Minister for Foreign Affairs. Ann will touch upon how the relationship between Sweden and the United States and look back on how it evolved during her term as the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And with that, I leave the floor to you, Ann Linde.
So, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I'm very glad to be able to stand here and speak to you about one of the most significant and enduring diplomatic relationship in history, and that is the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Sweden. Over the decades, these two nations has fostered a bond based on shared values, cooperation, and mutual respect. Today I will delve into the historical context, the present state, and the future potential in this invaluable alliance on the 10 minutes I have, but it could be for like 10 hours. But it is not possible to talk about any international issue and not start with the Russian unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine. Sweden and United States stand shoulder to shoulder in our condemnation of the strongest possible terms of Russian aggression. It is a flagrant violation of international law. Together with the international community, we demand that Russia ceases its military invasion immediately and unconditionally and withdraws all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine, including Crimea. Sweden and the United States stand in solidarity with Ukraine and its people. Our support to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity should be steadfast and continue as long as it takes for Ukraine to win. But back to the topic of today. To fully appreciate the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Sweden, we must first understand its historical roots. Dating back to the 18th century, when Sweden became one of the first countries to recognize the newly independent United States, the foundation of this relationship was forged on a belief of liberty, democracy, and human rights. Throughout the centuries, this bond has grown stronger, enduring 2 world wars, the Cold War, and numerous global challenges. In the present day, the United States and Sweden stand as steadfast allies, collaborating on a wide range of issues. One of the key aspects of this relationship is security and defense cooperation. Sweden's commitment to a strong national defense and its contributions to international peacekeeping operation align with the United States' priorities. Together, they work to ensure regional stability and promote global security. A historic change in Sweden's security policy took place last year when we, with a solid majority in the parliament, decided to apply for membership in NATO. When I signed the application on the 17th of May, it marked the end of for our country, a very successful security policy of 200 years of neutrality, then non-alignment, then military non-alignment. In this process, we have had a solid support from our American friends. In May last year, I visited not only my counterpart, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, but also many senators, including the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, who promised strong support if we should apply. I even got him to take up his calendar to squeeze in the days where the Congress could take the ratification decision, so it had to be before the summer break. With Secretary Blinken, I discussed the possibility of United States to grant Sweden security assurances during the most vulnerable period for our country's security, when we left the military non-alignment but still hadn't got the security of Article 5 in NATO. And as you all know, President Biden, in a very solemn event in the White House garden with Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson and President Niinistö, promised that the United States had granted Sweden and Finland security assurances in the period before we became full members. Another crucial area of collaboration is the promotion of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Both nations firmly believe in the principles of freedom and equality. Sweden's long-standing tradition of neutrality, non-alignment, and diplomacy, coupled with the United States' commitment to global leadership, and now our new way of choosing NATO membership, allows our countries to stand together in championing democracy, protecting human rights, and addressing global challenges as climate change and poverty. Sweden played a dominant role at the Democracy Summit hosted by President Biden, not the least when it comes to equality between men and women. Economically, the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Sweden is vital. Trade and investment flows between the two nations, and they are robust, with strong bilateral ties that benefit both economies. American companies have found success in Sweden, and Swedish firms have thrived in the United States, contributing to job creation and economic growth in both countries. As we move forward, there is an immense potential for further collaboration in emerging sectors such as clean energy, innovation, and technology. At every trip I made to the United States as a Minister of Trade, I always brought with me a booklet that show how many jobs Swedish companies create in every single state in America. And with no exceptions, the congressmen, the senators, and others, they were actually impressed. One of the most important events during the current Swedish EU presidency was the Trade and Technology meeting in Luleå, the last days in May. TTC is the main forum for the EU and the US to coordinate approaches to key global trade, economic, and technology issues. Beyond politics and economics, the cultural ties between the United States and Sweden have fostered rich exchange of ideas, art, and people. From the influence of Swedish design and music to the shared appreciation for the literature and film, cultural exchanges have deepened the understanding and friendship between these two nations. I heard actually this morning on the radio that Max Martin's newest musical, and Juliet, who is a feminist musical only with Max Martin hits, is a smash hit now also in America. They got 9 nominations for Grammys. They didn't win though, but still. Academic partnership and student exchange have also contributed to a vibrant intellectual exchange, promoting learning and understanding on both sides of the Atlantic. Looking for the future, the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Sweden holds immense promises. As we confront global challenges like climate change, terrorism, and pandemics, the need for cooperation and collaboration is more critical than ever. By leveraging their collective strength and expertise, the United States and Sweden can serve as a global leader as global leaders in finding sustainable solutions to these pressing issues. One example is the very close cooperation I had with John Kerry on the issue of climate and security. And we held actually an event together on this topic at the last year's United Nations General Assembly in New York. Another typical area is the fight against terrorism and organized crime. The Swedish Commissioner, Mrs. Ylva Johansson, will host the next EU-US Justice and Home Affairs Ministerial meeting on the 20th and 21st of June in Stockholm. However, for this relationship to thrive, it requires a continuous effort and dedication. It demands an open dialogue, respectful engagement, and a shared commitment to common goals. It is essential for both nations to actively seek opportunities to deepen our cooperation, whether through diplomatic channels, business partnership, people-to-people connection, or events like this one we are taking part in now. In conclusion, the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Sweden is a testament to enduring power of shared values, of mutual respect and cooperation. It's a bond that has weathered the test of time and continues to evolve to address the challenges of the 21st century. By nurturing and strengthening this relationship, we can ensure actually a brighter future for both nations and contribute to a more peaceful and a prosperous world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ann-Linda. You were talking a lot about trade policy. You were the Minister for Trade before. We see a lot of discussions in the US and in Europe about big packages, the Inflation Reduction Act. Do you see the world as being more protectionist now than when you were Trade Minister, and where do you see it heading?
Unfortunately, there is a definite yes on that question. Because what we see now is that the security issues are so pressing, and we need really to build up the defense forces. We need to make NATO stronger. We have a bigger enemy in Russia. We have a more assertive China. At the same time, we are very much depending on free trade, on the possibility to get innovation by sharing ideas, and by doing a more restrictive trade order, and to put all this investment screening and everything only a matter of security, where it's not an economic issue, but it's purely a security issue, we might actually make ourselves in the long run weaker, because we don't get as much on innovation and research as we should do. On the same time, there needs to be a discussion on the balance. It was like last week when we had the meeting of the European Council of Foreign Relations. My former Spanish colleague, Laia Gonzalez Arantxa, I just call her Arantxa, I forget her last name. She said in the panel that well, before it was the trade chars who had the primacy over the security people, and now it's the other way around. It's the security people who has the primacy over the trade chars. And we need to find a balance, because we need also technology, for example, from Asia, to be able to do all the things that we need also for defense.
You were also discussing democracy and the rule of law, and how the US and Sweden has had a good cooperation. And still, we remember the last administration and all that happened there. You have an election coming up in the US where you have more protectionist candidates than the current president, as well as when you look at towards the rule of law. Do you think that the election will have as big of an impact as it did in 2016 or in 2020? Or has this become the new normal, that we don't really know what happens to the relationship? Or has it been the same even ever since 2016 with Sweden?
Well, one thing is that I always say is that no matter who is the president of the United States, for Sweden it's vital to have a good relation. So even if the former president comes back, which I don't hope, because he has not my political views, we need to have a good relationship anyway. But we can see that there has been radicalization also of the Republican Party, and you can also see that most of those who are now in the Republican president race has, for example, most, not all, but most of the 11 has spoken that we should not get so much into supporting Ukraine, and we need to have the America first, even on a higher priority. And I think that's bad sign for generally for the relation. And in the, as you mentioned, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, we have got some exemption, like the electronic cars. But otherwise, it's not a good idea to have a trade war between the United States and the EU. It's not beneficial for either of us.
And a last question. We know that we've been talking about the pivot to Asia since the Obama administration. The U.S. has made clear China is the future where policy lays. Do you think Sweden, with the NATO membership and a close ally to the U.S., will have a bigger role in the Pacific, or do you think it will be more in Europe?
What's important is that here we need to do everything together in EU. And we have tried very, very hard from the Swedish side to have an EU policy more than a national Swedish policy. We have a Swedish policy as well, but since we are just not a small country but a mid country, it's not possible for us to do so much as what we can do together with the EU. So that's number one. But then I think it has been, I don't know how, decades now nearly, that United States has said that they need to turn more to Asia, and also the last, since Obama, even more, to China, because also of the fear for something happening with Taiwan. And we saw how impossible it was for the rest of the world to save Hong Kong. I mean, that's something that I really, really feel bad about. I mean, we tried in EU to do everything to save the democracy in Hong Kong. We have sanctioned, we made political remarks, we have diplomatic pressure, and they just said, okay, now we take it, and they took it, and democracy in Hong Kong is gone, and the rest of the world we could just look at it, and it's terrible. And if something happens with Taiwan, what will happen then? That could be some really, really catastrophic way. So the answer is yes, EU has to deal more, I think, with relation with Asia and China, but no, not Sweden alone, but inside the cooperation of the EU family.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you.
We will now listen to Barry Pavel, who's the Vice President for RAND's National Security Research Division and the Director for the National Defence Research Institute. Ms. Pavel will speak to us about the foreign policy of the United States going forward and where the United States are looking and where they are heading. I think the previous speaker and I myself have pointed one way. So the floor is yours, Barry.
Well, thanks very much, and it's a real honor to be here, and pretty much impossible to follow Minister Lind, but I'll offer some ideas. The title that I was given was U.S. Foreign Policy in the 2030s. So I'm going to do a lot of baseless speculation about what might be coming our way in the 7 to 15 year time frame. Whether the U.S. government in power after the next 2 presidential elections will come to these challenges and priorities is an open question. So this is more of a thought experiment about the long term, which is something I've tried to do my whole career, where I like to say my community is very good at being surprised. We always focus on this, and then that happens. And so what I try to do is, well, what might be the next kind of that? And so I really, to me, it comes down to 3 very large, somewhat related planetary or global challenges that I think the impacts of which will grow more apparent every year. And then, so I think eventually our bureaucracies will get to these focus areas. Number one, most urgently, the growing risks of artificial intelligence, which this year we're only now starting to see the potential, and then I would also add synthetic biology. Number two, where we're currently focused now, the potential additional challenges posed by the Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia, but they're helped by other countries like North Korea and Iran and others. And then third, the accelerating impacts of climate change, which I think again will become quite apparent. I'll start with AI because I think that's the biggest risk from what I understand. I'm not a technologist, but I listen to them as closely as I can, including this morning and some reading this morning. And it seems that most of us are vastly underappreciate sort of the timelines and the risks that are associated with coming developments in artificial intelligence. I mean, some of the scientists are talking about extinction level capabilities. And so, that really gets one's attention. This isn't a science fiction movie. This is actually reality. Reality now. And when you listen to the tech company CEOs, it seems that the timelines may be closer than they had thought even 6 months ago. The timelines for a really structural set of challenges that the window will be closing on dealing with. So the release of ChatGPT-4 by Microsoft and OpenAI really has accelerated these projections as people have watched the continued development of what's called large language models, which ChatGPT-4 is. The current version is quite imperfect, but the next generations of the technology are moving quite quickly. So much so that you had the main CEOs of the companies involved going to the U.S. Congress and saying, we need to be regulated. And then you've seen the open letters by thousands of scientists calling for regulation. So I think this should really be a wake-up call for policymakers, for governments to really take stock of the problem and then work together to deal with it. We're fortunate right now that the companies involved are very few. We're talking a handful of companies that are developing the capability, and even their supply chains are very narrow right now. But how long this will last is really hard to estimate accurately, and so it just seems there's a consensus that governance is needed, both technical governance as well as regulatory governance, and it's urgently needed. And the words I'm seeing, the timelines I'm seeing are months, not years. This is a 2024, 2025 problem that I think is really should be more urgently appreciated. It's also worth mentioning synthetic biology, where the risks are also underestimated. It strikes me the difference between synthetic biology and artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence, the circumstances are pretty, as I said, narrow, and I think governance is possible if action is taken quickly. With synthetic biology, my understanding is that, for example, the tool of DNA synthesizers, those are available for $100,000. Anybody who has that kind of cash. Those who have these capabilities are alarmingly networked together. And I think from my understanding, again, if in the wrong hands, millions of people could die if a pathogen was developed by those who would have the will to do so. We currently have no mechanism for countering this particular type of risk. So that really, to me, and it's something I've kind of been looking at my whole career, where the biggest difference between the threat and our preparedness, and this is before the COVID pandemic, I think it's really massive, and the risk will only grow as the technology is further democratized. So these are two big problems, I think, that certainly we in our community at the RAND Corporation and others, we're really struck with this and trying to develop options for policymakers. Second, on China and Russia, just a few words that I like to try to put things a little starkly. To me, they're allies in every sense of the word, but our bureaucracies kind of treat them as separately, just separate problems. And I even have colleagues in my community in the US who are saying that we should only focus on China, that we shouldn't worry about Russia, let Europe handle Russia. The stakes are much higher, in Asia, as if China's reach was only regional and not global, as one, I think, fallacy of this view, and also as if a major war in the Pacific, and Rand has done some analysis on this, would greatly damage Europe's economies, European countries' economies as well, and some Rand analysis points to the likelihood of a global depression if there's a full-scale invasion of Taiwan by China. So this is a global interest, and the days when we could say this region and that region, and those are long, those days are over. And so to me, a decisive defeat of Putin and his invasion in Ukraine would greatly weaken Xi Jinping, who hitched his wagon before the invasion to Putin, despite the growing domestic challenges that Putin faces in China. They range from a very significantly slowing economy to unprecedented demographic risks, a very depressed technology sector. I was reading this morning about how layoffs at some of the major Chinese technology companies in the tens of thousands, I think they were talking about Alibaba this morning, really creating a significantly constrained technology sector. There's a corporate debt crisis, and the list goes on. So I just think the numerous domestic challenges facing Xi Jinping, in addition to a defeat of Putin, could really constrain China. Would that make Xi Jinping more aggressive? I don't know. I mean, that's a question we could all discuss. One issue on sort of burden sharing and military issues, I think if the U.S. ended up having to come to contribute to Taiwan's self-defense if China attacked, and we had a situation where hundreds or thousands of American military force personnel are dying every single day, I think the risks for the transatlantic relationship would be almost catastrophic. Where Americans would say, "Why? I thought this affects Europe. Why isn't Europe, involved in some degree?" So I'm not at all suggesting to move all European military to the Pacific, but I do think. Again, from my community, those who say, Europeans handle Russia, I think we need to be together, sharing responsibility, sharing risks, sharing burdens, and we could talk about the proportions. But I think it's really important for us to share those things. And similarly, if Europe were to have to fight a war against a Russian invasion of Europe proper, and the U.S. were not engaged, that would be catastrophic too. So I just think we need to stay together and not have these kind of silly discussions about, China's more important and the stakes are higher here or there. One more point on the war that's going on. I think we're not thinking as ambitiously as we should be. We heard Xi Jinping say to Vladimir Putin after the state dinner in Moscow a couple months ago, it was an off-mic moment, so he forgot about his mute button. I remembered mine. After the state dinner, he said to Putin, we have the opportunity, if we work together, to shape the next 100 years of global history, so let's really focus on this together. In the West, when we think about the end of the war in Ukraine, we're talking about borders, we're talking about Crimea or not Crimea. We're not thinking as ambitiously as our competitors are. So I think this is, again, a place like FOI and RAND. We should be coming up with very ambitious suggestions, if Putin is decisively defeated, for remaking global architecture. And I'm happy to talk about some suggestions, but others here also, I'm sure, have a lot too. The third issue I raised was climate change, and I am very modest about my knowledge, especially in this audience, but its impacts too are accelerating. It too is an extinction level challenge that we should all come together, and the transatlantic relationship, as Minister Lind said, is critical, absolutely critical, for effectively mitigating and dealing with all of the challenges that climate change brings. I might just end by saying that all of these very significant risks absolutely require far closer transatlantic cooperation than we've ever had in our history. We have a lot of obstacles, certainly in the U.S. regulatory system, in the U.S. Congress, to much greater, and in the U.S. executive branch, the Defense Department, to much greater cooperation on technology, on military planning, on operations, on critical trade issues. And I just think we need to sort of really realize the size of the challenge and the opportunity that is in front of us, and really come together and work much harder to remove those barriers, much closer cooperation. And certainly we in the United States understand that none of these challenges can be handled by the United States alone. That sometimes is the kind of ethic of our bureaucracy, and we heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, which was kind of developed as if the U.S. was handling it, handling some things alone, but obviously that's not the case, and I think we're very fortunate that hopefully very soon Sweden will become a formal treaty ally of the United States and of our other NATO allies, and that I think will unlock a lot more potential for even closer transatlantic cooperation. So I think with that, I'll end and really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Barry. You talked about China and Russia as allies. That's quite a strong statement. Some are more hesitant in calling them allies, but partners. But if you see them as allies, short of nuclear weapons, is there a situation where China could take a more pro-Ukrainian stance? And on the other side, is there a red line where China would intervene in the conflict more directly on the behalf of Russia?
Well, those are great questions, and my answers would be speculative. China has tried to posture itself as a peacemaker in the Ukraine regarding Putin's invasion, and I think obviously the plan that they came out with was not exactly an honest broker. It was very much consistent with the Russian narrative. And also, I think it's important to be reminded that China has its own public relations talking points, and those talking points are closely coordinated with the Russian Foreign Ministry. It's the same things you see Russia churning out publicly about Putin's invasion. The Chinese also churn out this disinformation and propaganda. So I don't see them intervening, in a dramatic way, the way you talked about. But I do think that they wish it would go away. It's not helpful for Chinese soft power for them to be aligned with this kind of horrific set of activities. Yeah. And what was your second question again? Which was a good one.
No, it was about China and Russia. Where will China intervene on the pro-Ukrainian side? Where will they intervene on the pro-Russian side?
Yeah, so I think they might end up supplying even more capable weapons than they've provided. I think it's been kind of funny in the press. They act as if China hasn't yet provided capabilities, but it's very clear that at least Chinese companies have provided drones and surveillance equipment for the Russian forces and the contractors. So they're already engaged, as are the Iranians and the North Koreans. And so I think, could they up that? Could their manufacturing capacity be harnessed in a way to really have a decisive impact? I think that's possible. And so we should be, continuing to look at that very closely.
And the last question regarding Ukraine. There are discussions and talks about the U.S. pays for the war, Europe pays for the reconstruction. Do you think there's a possibility for a Marshall Plan 2.0, or is it that the U.S. are going to make their major support and investments in the war, and Europe's going to be forced to focus on the reconstruction as well as military aid now?
Yeah, so my thought on this is, goes back to something I said. I mean, we have to be in these things together. And I don't think, U.S. does the war and Europe does the reconstruction. It's, the reconstruction estimates that I've seen are in the trillions. It's going to take a lot, but you use the right kind of frame. I think a Marshall Plan is the right kind of framework, and I think it's got to be a transatlantic effort that deals with that helps with reconstruction, not one or the other. The needs are massive, but my understanding of the way the Ukrainians work is the reconstruction will go to the next generation of various capabilities that they need, but it's going to be a long-term effort. And so the nature of the security arrangements is very, very relevant to reconstruction. You can't reconstruct under attack from missiles and other military capabilities every day. So I think how do we model the security arrangements, and that'll be discussed at the NATO Vilnius summit in July. But I think some are using models that might not be the right ones. I think, and Rand has done some analysis on this too that we could bring to bear.
Thank you so much for your remarks.
Thank you.
And next up, I invite the panel to take the stage, and we'll discuss tackling the future of Russia's military power and what that means for NATO and specific issues for Sweden and Finland. And it's Colin D. Smith, it's Mike Wienerstieg, and Magnus Christiansen. You have so long titles, so I'm going to save us some time and not go through them again. If we just stick at first with China and Russia, do you have any different views from Mr. Pavel when it comes to China entering the war directly or indirectly on behalf of Russia, or taking a more pro-Ukrainian stance? Colin?
I would say I'd probably have to agree with Barry in that I don't see, at least now, China wanting to be seen more on Russia's side than what they already have. They probably didn't like to see what happened. I think they thought they were going in with what would be an easy win, and by Ukraine standing up for themselves and being as successful as they were to repel the attack on Kyiv and prolong this war, China's now looking at it as, what have we gotten ourselves into, and the complications it's brought for their own desires with Taiwan. Yeah. So I don't think they'd want to further complicate that at this time.
Mike?
Well, I'm not a China specialist nor a Russian specialist, but I do have a number of people who work for me in my department, and they are very good at both these countries, and they all say essentially that the Chinese will avoid being seen as a formal ally or an ally in any sense to Russia, because they believe that the Russian understanding of how you behave as a great power is not good enough. I mean, they want to keep some distance to the Russian actions, but on the other hand, it's fairly obvious, as was seen in the quote that Barry kind of cited, that the ability for China and Russia to work together and to change things is very big, and they have to strike a balance here. I doubt that they will enter any form of formal allianceship or alliance relationship, so to speak, but they will certainly work as much as they can in terms of undermining Western efforts to keep the current order up.
Yeah. Would you like to join?
Well, I mean, I don't regard China and Russia as allies. For the simple reason that China and Russia are two civilizational states. They look down upon each other. They cannot truly have friends in world affairs. But I also regard Russia as a weaker and weaker actor in international politics. So I would actually choose the metaphor of subcontractor in an anti-Western policy. And I think that given sort of the macro trends for China and Russia, it's likely to continue like that. However, that doesn't mean that we cannot, that there is a risk that we end up in a situation if China pursues its policies in Asia, and we still have a conflict in Europe, in Ukraine, where these two, the subcontractor and the main firm, so to speak, actually can align, and that would be an extremely dangerous situation.
We've seen reports that the Ukrainian offensive has started, but before we come back to that, there were reports earlier about insurgents attacking Russians inside Russian territory using Western military aid. I don't know if that's been confirmed or not. Is this an escalation in the war? Will Russia see this as a major escalation, or is it everything is as usual? We've supplied them with military aid, of course they can attack Russia. Colin?
I mean, I've seen some of those kind of fringe groups, whether they're, I mean, clearly they're in support of Ukraine, whether they're trying to take advantage of a situation that maybe they just oppose Putin, and this is an opportunity to do something, I think is still being determined. In terms of whether this is an escalation of the war, I think Russia has to assume that anything on their periphery, even though they've always said that, you know, their version of it, maybe a red line would be attack on Mother Russia, but that there is going to be some bleed over, and I think it would be almost ignorant to not think in a war like this that they could contain it completely into Ukraine without there being some bleed over. Now, if it escalated into more attacks on Moscow itself and other things, I think it would be interesting to see what Russia's response would be to that. And if that was tied to the West, then that would, I think, bring the West or NATO, whatever, if it was specific weapons that were provided by the West that were then used on an attack against Moscow, I would think Moscow would absolutely see that as an escalation. But in terms of on the periphery, Russia knows that the West has provided weapons. They know that Western weapons are being used right now in the counteroffensive. Where those are used all in that periphery, I think would be part of that war. But anything beyond that, then I think Russia might view that differently.
Mike, Magnus, anything?
Well, I mean, the issue is still how much Moscow would dare attacking the West because of its indirect kind of way of warfare in Ukraine. In terms of Russian territory, which is the red line, so to speak, for Russian war planning, including the use of nuclear arms, they have defined already a number of the Ukrainian provinces as Russian territory and annexed them more or less legally, efficiently, so to speak. So they could use that as actually as an attack against if Western equipment or maybe even Western troops undercover or in some other way are using Western equipment to attack Russian forces on what they see as Russian territory, even if it's Ukraine, legally speaking, then that could be seen as a way of escalation, of course, or it could be a matter of escalation. But again, nuclear deterrence still works, I believe, and I doubt very much that we would see other attacks from Russia on Western countries neighboring Ukraine, for example.
Well, I think the primary problem is, of course, that this ties into a narrative that Moscow has, that it's under siege, that it's attacked by the West. Look here, they're sending weapons and they're attacking us directly. But I do agree here that there are limits here, and I think that the Russians actually making the other calculations. They already regard this as a conflict with the West. I mean, the Kremlin. So.
If we look at the future of Russian military power, we've seen they've lost fighter jets. They have a lot of them left. They've lost a lot of tanks. They have a lot of them left, modern, but also they're taken from the reserves. When you look at missiles, they're starting to deplete their the missiles with which you need to import parts for. Is Russia a lot weaker now conventionally than it was at the start of the war? And what's your analysis this far of Russian future, the future Russian military power?
I don't want to always feel like I'm going
let's
first.
start with
Maybe we'll start the other way.
I think Russia is likely to become a much weaker country, which means that will spill over on its military capabilities, because the Putin regime is unable to renew its economy, and without an economy you can't have a mighty armed force. The current regime will try to still make a big cycle to renew the mighty armed forces of Russia, and if they do that, they will end up in something that we call the defense dilemma, not the security dilemma, the defense dilemma. That is that the more you spend, you come to a point where if you spend as portion of your economy too much, then you actually undermine regime stability, and that's exactly where they're going to end up if they continue with this. So, and that leads to the second consequence, I believe, and that is that we're going to see a much more unstable Russia. How unstable and on what terms, that's of course very difficult to speculate about. But it means that Russia will become a weaker military actor, but at the same time a much more unstable and dangerous one. Not in the sense that they might win an all-out war against the West, but that they can create a lot of damage on the West, for the West.
Mike?
Well, of course, the current developments in Ukraine have meant that the Russian ability to mount other attacks in other directions, conventionally in particular, have been diminished dramatically, no doubt about that. But this is only a matter of timing, or time rather. I recall very well, slightly more than 10 years ago, I was visiting the RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C., talking with colleagues there. This was in 2012, I believe, about Russia and the threat we saw from Russia at the time, and the abilities of Russia that concerned us greatly at the time as well. And I was met with a wall of non-understanding, essentially. Everybody told me that, Mike, you're sounding like an Estonian, you know. This, you can't just go on like this. Russia's done, out. We have a reset policy. Now Medvedev is in charge, you know. Putin is out. Nothing dangerous will come out of Russia whatsoever. So I asked my colleagues at France, so what's your Russian studies people doing these days? Well, they said, we don't have that many these days. We have some old guys, but they're kind of semi-retired, and that's about it. And a year and a half later, Russia invaded Crimea. The Pentagon, if I recall correctly, signed off for a grant to RAND for $8 million or something on studying Russia and do it quickly. I mean, Pentagon can move quickly sometimes when it realizes that it has to. And then, of course, all kinds of things happen very quickly as well after that. My point is that Russia will be down now in conventional abilities for a long time, but not more than a few years, 5 years at most, I would say, before they start rearranging their army again and also build new equipment. This has always happened with Russia, and it will happen this time too.
But do you see, before Colin answers, will they be able to get the same equipment if we're looking a few years ahead and the sanctions are still there, or are we going to see an older Russian army when this is done?
Well, I mean, of course they will have problems with the sanctions, as they used a lot of Western technology in their canned inventory, for example, when it comes to sighting systems for tanks and the like. They are French, as far as I understand it right now, in their more modern tanks. That will change. They will have to invent new ones, new domestic systems of that kind, and I don't doubt at all that they will be able to do it. They have done it before as well. I mean, Russian military equipment has always been more kind of primitive in a technological sense than Western ones, but it's still been working, you know, and they could certainly, after a number of years, maybe 10 years rather than 5, but still develop what they need for an agile fighting force again. It will take a lot of time, but they will do it.
Yeah. Colin?
So first, to Mike's comment, I'd like to think that RAND is restocked if they were ever low on their Russian experts, but have restocked, and hopefully I'm a part of that restocking, having only been with them for a couple of years now. And I think another one of Mike's most recent comments, though, that comes out is that it does bring in, how, to your question on what Russia's ability to regenerate equipment, continue to do stuff. I think that's where allies like China or partners in China come in. And Iran has already demonstrated clearly their ability to provide drones. Iran's getting technology. So, you know, Russia is learning ways around that, and they will continue to do that. And as much as they've been very slow to adapt, at least in the first 9 months of the war, but you're already starting to see ways that they're adapting to war. And that in terms of missiles, your initial question, I wouldn't lump all of their armed forces together in terms of what their current capabilities are, where they've been degraded, and where they're going in the future. So first, on missiles, they're still producing missiles. In fact, Western analysts have thought that by now they would be out of some of their precision-guided missiles, their Kinzhals, some of their hybrid missiles, but they're still coming. Now they're going directly to the battlefield, and then they're being used, but they are continuing to produce them. So where are they getting that technology from? How are they able to keep doing that? Is a good thing for us to figure out. So I think missiles and those kinds of things, albeit in smaller quantities, they still keep coming. They haven't run out of those precision-guided munitions that we would have thought of. Their Air Force has really not taken, when you look at the totality of the Russian Air Force, is huge, and they've only taken a small percentage of kind of, if you want to call it casualties, losses. But how they fight, I think, is just very different than how we thought they would fight. We thought they would fight similar to the way the West would fight in terms of ground-air support. And that's just clearly not how they trained. They were more designed to be defensive in a way, but now they're having to be offensive, so they didn't really train to be offensive. They're more designed to be defending of Mother Russia. And so from that perspective, they still could do that. And then now ground forces I think is totally different. They've lost a lot of their modern stuff. They will not be able to replace a lot of that anytime quickly. And I think the bigger thing is the personnel. So I look at what they lost in the first 2 or 3 months of the war. They lost a lot of their forward-thinking lieutenants, captains, majors. They don't really have an NCO corps the way the Western militaries do, but they have starshinas, they have senior sergeants. Those were all killed. When you hear of commanders that were getting killed, lieutenant colonels that were battalion commanders that were killed in the beginning of the war, why did they have to be up front? Well, because their other junior leaders were already being killed. And so you can't really replace that. So, if you want to look 5, 10 years down, I think the scariest lesson for NATO is if Russia does figure out how to really do a military the right way with NCOs. Now, it would take a long time to do that, but that would actually make them more of a threat. Do they actually learn that? I'm not convinced they will learn it. We thought they were learning it. We thought that's what they were doing in the last 10 years of modernization, but instead they didn't. If anything, Gerasimov and Shoigu more recently, the modernization they started in 2010, 2011, 2012, they said, never mind, we're going back away from that, and we're gonna go back to the way we fought. And look what happened in Ukraine.
Magnus, you want to comment?
Well, I think there's a political lesson here in discussing what kind of Russia we will have over the next years, and that is that there's very often the analogy with the Cold War. But the Cold War, we had a strong and stable Soviet Union. The way I see things, if we're moving to a militarily weaker and unstable Russia, it's going to be a completely different political dynamic. And NATO's role will of course be affected by that.
What will NATO's role be?
Well, it depends on 2 factors, I believe. The first one is the European security order, which is really up in the air right now. But also, and this is perhaps a separate seminar, but this also ties into the global world order. As I said, Russia is a subcontractor to an anti-Western alliance that basically sort of is driven by China. I think that NATO's role will actually be something of a subcontractor in a liberal countermeasure for this. And so I believe that NATO's role must be tied to a global agenda. There's a lot of talk of China in Brussels, but we don't really see this role in the strategic concept. For the simple reason that this is what George Kennan said, a political war. It's not primarily about defense planning, about Article 5. It's a political war. It's about economic standards. It's about political influence. And that has not really sunk in. I mean, the frontline states in Europe, they focus on being frontline states, and the major powers haven't really figured out a clear role for NATO yet.
Mike or Colin, how from the US perspective, like there was talk about NATO being obsolete from not a lot of persons, but specific persons, we see it's not that obsolete. Does NATO has to change in some way? Of course, Finland just joined, but is it the same? It's Article 5, keep building your army's defense budgets, or does something major have to change in this situation with the war?
Well, I never thought NATO was obsolete. So I think from that, I'll take that right off the table. I mean, NATO, I think, is strong, is getting stronger with Finland and Sweden. I think it stabilizes what was always a difficult defense situation in terms of the defense of the Baltics. Not that it couldn't be done, but by the addition of Finland, and I say Sweden because I think it will happen, so I'll just lump that together instead of a precursor that when it happens, but it will happen, is that situation just becomes that much more difficult, say for Russia, and the cost that would be put on them if they decided they wanted to do something in the Baltics. Because whereas previously there was the idea that Russia could create a bit of a bubble to protect any actions they took within the Baltics. Now that bubble, I think, is popped because it's the opposite. Now once you add Finland and Sweden into that security structure, architecture, now they really don't even leave their ports. I mean, it really just becomes not safe for them to leave their ports if it's a conflict between Russia and NATO with Sweden and Finland. Sweden in particular, because of the capabilities that it already has, and with Gotland Island and just the way it's positioned, just completely makes NATO that much stronger. But I would have to go back to earlier comments this morning by our first two distinguished speakers, in that the cooperation is key. And we can't lose sight of China as, I think, the longer range, bigger kind of threat to the global international order. And how do we look at trade, security? We have to look at ourselves, but we have to do it cooperatively. I think there's a lot of things that Sweden brings to the table with technology. You look at chips in terms of Taiwan producing chips. So how can Europe do better to produce chips, to diversify, that then strengthens not only the private sector, but strengthens the defense sector?
I have to ask you, Mike, it sounded earlier that you almost said like Sweden now outside of NATO is safer than Sweden before outside of NATO because Russia is more weakened. If we look at Sweden outside of NATO, if we stay outside of NATO, if that becomes the decision or it gets halted, what will that mean for Sweden?
Well, I think Sweden will become a member of NATO in the coming few weeks, actually. So I'm not that
Before
pessimistic.
Vilnius or at
Well,
Vilnius?
two Vilnius anyway. I mean, maybe just before or at the very summit. What I'm hearing now from the Turks tells me actually that this is a clear possibility anyway. Much more so than only a month ago, I would say. But still, I mean, we are now in kind of not the Irish situation, but we are now kind of surrounded by NATO countries, and we have one problematic neighbor which is kind of not far away, but it's still not at all as close as it used to be, in the sense that all the Baltic states are in NATO. Even if Sweden is not part of NATO right now, it will be soon, and then, as Colin is alluding to, the Baltic Sea will be a NATO lake, and that is a game changer in terms of geopolitical and geostrategic kind of conditions for Russia to act in, and that is very good. We are still much safer now than we were only 2 years ago, as we have applied for NATO membership. We have the security assurances, as Anlena mentioned, from not only the United States, but a range of countries, actually. And this is very good. For Russia to do something here right now, either against us or even less so the Baltic states and so on, is very far-fetched in my mind, not only considering the actual, let's say, abilities that they have right now, but because if you look at the current most problematic units in Russia that always have posed a threat to us, like the 76th Air Assault Division in Pskov and the Pechenga Brigade and close to the Finnish border. I mean, these are all gone. I mean, not gone entirely, but they're heavily decimated in Ukraine. And we have now, we can, I mean, play this thing pretty coolly and wait for the Turks to make up their mind, and then we will be a member of NATO in July.
I think it's safe to say that at all analysis, if Russia invades or puts troops on Swedish soil, it's only for the reason of attacking NATO or the Baltics. So,
Sure.
I think does anybody want to make final remarks? Otherwise, I'll open up for questions.
I'm fine with questions.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I never warned you, so I'll ask one more and you can. I never asked this because I think I know the answer. Is there a role for NATO in the Pacific in the future?
Everyone's looking at me.
We're not members yet, so you should start.
I guess the short answer is yes, there's a role in that. I think the threat that China could pose is an international global threat. And so whether it's an EU working collectively to try and help counter and be a balance to that, whether that's a NATO, I think it's almost, I'm not going to say world versus China, but the world has to be aware of what China ultimately in the long run wants to do. So from that perspective, because NATO is a defense and a military alliance, that if it did become militarily an issue with Taiwan, then that's something that all the NATO members would have to look at what that participation would be.
Well, I mean, when Biden was campaigning, he was talking about the summit of democracy. I think we should forget about all these stovepipes that we have on the Western side and actually connect the dots here geopolitically. And so, of course, we need to see that this, that there are connections here. The exact role and whether NATO is actually primarily focused on this is, of course, a secondary issue. What I believe is the important thing now is to get across the analysis.
Mike?
Well, I think there are many possibilities for NATO to do better and more visible job in Asia, to be sure. The problem is that NATO is not unified on these things. I heard the other week that France had opposed to a U.S. initiative in terms of setting up a NATO kind of information office or something in, if it was Japan or somewhere else in Asia. I don't recall really, but it was
Japan.
Japan, yeah, right. And the French were vehemently against this, of course, as they don't want to see NATO as a global alliance, but instead a European or transatlantic alliance. And there are issues with this. On the other hand, we need to understand as well, as both Colin and Barry was talking about earlier, namely that the European countries cannot balance Russia on their own. It's short of producing thousands of nuclear weapons in most European countries, balancing the Russian nuclear arsenal. There's no way for Europe to balance Russia on its own. We need American support to do that, and at the same time, of course, we need to be helpful in one way or another in Asia too. We cannot bring that much forces there, I believe, because the environment is not conducive to that. But on the other hand, to support Western, American, Japanese, or whatever initiatives in that area would be very helpful.
Yeah.
And we can work a lot more on that.
Just another important thing is that one of the most dangerous situations now is, of course, that there's no dialogue. We're entering into this bipolar with subcontractors struggle, political struggle, and there is absolutely no dialogue about this, not between arms control, etc., etc. And I believe that it's very important to get this dialogue going. Under the Putin regime, it's of course not possible, but I believe that we must have some form of concert among the major powers. Right now, that's probably the most dangerous situation for the international system, that we're approaching a sort of nuclear parity of China, and that will actually increase the instability in international politics.
Yeah. Just before we end, we're discussing NATO. You have the BRICS countries, you have other regional organizations. Do you see any of them evolving to becoming perhaps not a security alliance, but evolving more into a cooperative alliance? Let's take the BRICS, for example.
I'm not an Asia expert as much, but I think a lot of it will depend on how China continues its own actions and what those other countries then feel. If they feel threatened by it, then I think I would hope that they would react to that.
Mike?
Well, the Russians and the Chinese, increasingly so, the Russians are playing on what they call the global south very strongly. Mr. Lavrov has been touring African countries now for a number of tours or number of rounds. The Chinese are there already investing tremendously in terms of infrastructure and the like, and also buying political support. And we see that when there are votes in the UN against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, most of the African countries are abstaining, actually. They're not voting in favor of Western resolutions against the Russian invasion. And if this continues, and if the Russians and the Chinese play their cards skillfully, we will certainly have a less Western-oriented and less nice environment globally to deal with. That's true. But I also doubt that these countries in the long run will be putting all their eggs in the Russian and Chinese baskets, so to speak.
Yeah. Got a question at the front.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. My name is Katrina Yuknevichuta. I'm from the RAND Corporation. I think we're all keeping our fingers crossed for July 11th and what we hope will come of that day. I was just wondering, what can Sweden learn, and I guess in broader terms NATO, from Finland's accession process, and what lessons can we take away from the recent NATO accession of Finland?
The greatest lesson learned is that don't change your security policy in the middle of a war in Europe. Think things through and change your policy in time. I think isn't that a takeaway? But we haven't had that discussion here in Sweden because there needs to be a national consensus and we need to get in. But of course there's time for reckoning, and we need to discuss how we ended up in this mess eventually.
Well, I mean, if you look at Finland, there was one big difference from the beginning, and that was the substantial issue from the Turkish side with the Kurdish minority here in Sweden, which is very big. Reasonably, they're as big as the Turkish minority, about 100,000 people each, roughly. But the Kurdish minority parts of it have been very vocal in terms of supporting various Kurdish organizations, including the PKK and so on. That hasn't been the case in Finland. So the Turks had a number of issues with Sweden in that sense. But on the other hand, talking about the Turks, you never know what they are actually up to in terms of deals in this regard. So I can't say that this is the only thing that we should have done otherwise. But on the other hand, we have now changed a lot of things accordingly in terms of a new law against terrorism and terrorism financing and so on that went into the books last week, actually. There are other things that we don't want to change. Finland still has blasphemy laws, for example. It's illegal, as far as I understand it anyway, to burn holy scriptures in Finland, like Bibles and the Quran and other things. It's not here. Since 1970, we got rid of all that. I mean, we had blasphemy laws here as well. But we don't want to get them back, on the other hand, and this is a freedom of speech thing. I believe it's still legal, for example, in the United States to burn both Bibles and Qurans and the like. This is a freedom of expression issue, and we don't want to change that. But this is this is a clear difference in terms of what the Turks have been pointing at in terms of differences between Finland and Sweden.
Any more questions?
Christer Palin from the Swedish Defence Research Agency. Many thanks for a lot of insightful comments from the speakers. One question. We have a weakened Russia now, for at least for a few years. At the same time, we have some fine decisions in order to improve Western deterrence and defense for the next 5 to 10 years. Is there a risk that the alliance loses sight of these goals, and maybe we will see some less cohesion in the while we work to attain these goals? And how, if so, how could we deal with that risk?
I would say yes, there is a risk, is if you try and think of Russia in terms of their ground capabilities not being able to mount another offensive. Therefore, why do you need to boost your own defenses if there's not a greater threat? And I would just go back to what my colleague said earlier when he visited Rand in 2010, 2012, that there was you don't have to worry about Russia. I think you need to truly understand Russia's psyche, and that they are always going to see the West as a threat, and that by Finland and Sweden joining NATO, that just reinforces their own internal psyche, that it's just a matter of time before NATO gains enough strength and power and goes to invade Russia. So, I mean, until you can somehow, the Russians themselves change and decide they want to be part of a greater European community, they're always going to see the West as a threat. They're always going to figure out a way to rearm themselves. And then they're going to, beyond that, then they're going to want their buffer back, because that's just the way they think. And so that will always leave those on the periphery at some form of risk. When that happens, I think that's what we're debating and trying to figure out now. But I think it would be almost tragic if the West, and NATO in particular, was to think that we can take an operational pause on rearming and increasing our stockpiles now when there's an opportunity, instead of realizing maybe 10 years from now, 5 years from now, oops, we really should have done more.
Magnus?
Well, I think it's a clear risk. Not for us living in the Baltic Sea region, because as Colin Gray put it, geography is inescapable. We have the Kola Peninsula, we have the Gulf of Finland, we have Kaliningrad. But of course, in the intra-alliance discussions, of course, Southern Europe will have different priorities, etc. The key, as Mike was referring to, the key is, of course, the policy in Washington. Really to keep a strong and robust transatlantic link. That's going to be the challenge, I believe. And of course, we can do. We will find key allies in our region that will basically have the same interests.
Mike?
Well, I agree completely with both Colin's and Magnus' latest statements here. And on Washington, though, I mean, we are hearing and we are visited occasionally by, smart young Republican leaders coming here telling us that Russia is uninteresting. I mean, they have gone back to the Obama years, essentially, which is very ironic in many ways, saying that Russia is of no significance whatsoever, despite the war in Ukraine that is already ongoing. But they say, given the fact that China is 10 times bigger in terms of population than Russia, given the fact that that's the base of current global manufacturing, for example, of all kinds of things, they have a clear vision, these Americans argue, the Chinese that is, of what they want with the world, and they will want to change the world accordingly as well. Thus, we need to focus completely and only on China, not deal with Russia whatsoever. But this is stupid in my mind. Geopolitics, after all, is a Swedish invention. The term was coined, I'm serious, the term was coined by a Swedish political scientist in an article in 1899. So it's an old, so to speak, theory of how things are going. And the merger of geography and politics, that was his key point, Rudolf Kjellén, a former professor of political science in Uppsala. And that has been developed by others, of course, Sir Halford Mackinder, Nicholas Bickman, and others. And they always said that if you want to have a geopolitical outlook, you should focus on the so-called Eurasian landmass, i.e. both Europe and Asia. And if you want to know where the wars are going to start, then you're going to look at which powers are trying to dominate that entire landmass, the Eurasian landmass, that is. And if there are powers who want to do that, to form a single kind of power dominating that entire place, then everybody else, including the United States, will try to stop it. And that means that you have to keep your eyes both on the eastern end and on the western end of this landmass. And this is what's going on right now. The American engagement in Ukraine is much bigger, ironically enough, than the European engagement in terms of military aid in particular. And I think actually, if you look at the Trump administration, even if you disregard the statements of the president himself, his administration actually raised the level of spending for the defense of Europe, increased the number of military troops in Europe for the defense of Europe. Maybe Mr. Trump himself didn't know all this, I don't know, but he allowed his administration to do it anyway. And this is, of course, also a very geopolitically informed decision by the Pentagon planners.
Thank you all so much for participating in this panel. Thank you to Ann Linde for her speech and to Barry Pavel for his speech. And from myself as Society in Defense, we'd like to thank the RAND Corporation and the Swedish Defence Research Agency for this collaboration. And of course, a big thank you to all of you who came here and who followed us online. And please make sure to follow us on social media and on our webpage for further seminars. And as Mike talked about the Global South, on Wednesday in this venue at the same time, we are discussing China and Russia's role in Africa. So you have a warm welcome if you want to come to the audience. With that, we conclude this seminar. Thank you so much.